This dark moment for his family, in particular to Gabriel and John, who are with us today. In 2010, Julian Assange exposed war crimes and human rights violations by the USA and its allies in the Iraq and Afghan war logs, and in the collateral murder video. A decade-long persecution began. Because of this persecution, Julian is currently the victim of British injustice in Belmarsh High Security Prison, where the COVID virus is running rampant, awaiting extraditions to the USA, where he may be sentenced to 175 years for some of the greatest pieces of journalism of the 21st century. What is happening to Julian is an attack on media freedom. The people behind Julian's persecution are the US national security state and their allies in the Five Eyes. It's their way to intimidate other journalists and news organisations. They are saying, if you're exposing war crimes, we're coming after you. And while some journalists are calling for the protection of whistleblowers and urging the formation of anti-corruption bodies, a large part of the media is ignoring the whole substance of the achievements of WikiLeaks and Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange. I'll now pass to Kasun.
Thank you, John, and thank you for coming. My name is Kasun Ubayasiri. I'm a Griffith University academic and a journalist. My interest as a researcher these days is focusing on human rights, press freedom and journalism ethics, and particularly in that context, looking at war crimes, reporting armed conflict and refugee migration, exactly the kind of stuff that Julian and WikiLeaks have been exposing. I'm also a state delegate for the MEAA. The MEAA press freedom is something that is very close to our heart at the Union. And particularly in the last couple of years, because we're seeing increasing pressure, increasing threats on Australian journalists, and I count Julian among them. I've also worked I started life as a journalist covering in Sri Lanka during the Civil War. So I understand the pressures that journalists face and the toll, the cost for their work. So in that sense, as a fellow journalist, I'm particularly conscious of what you're going through as family members and what Julian is going through. Anyway, over to you, John. Or do you want me to introduce Greg?
Yes, well, there's a special. What's happening is Greg has to leave very shortly, so we're going to ask questions of him. Then we'll turn to John and Ciaron.
So our first of our three panel members is Greg Barnes, who is a barrister, author and a political activist and a commentator. He has worked full-time as a barrister from 86 to 89 and since 2003. He took silk in Tasmania in May this year. Greg has been very active in politics between 89 and 2003. He was the advisor to the New South Wales Premier Nick Greiner from 89 to 90, Victorian opposition leader Alan Brown from 90 to 91, Tasmanian Premier Ray Groom from 93 to 96, and he has served as Chief of Staff for the Federal Finance Minister John Fay from 96 to 99. He was the political campaign director of the Australian Republican movement, the referendum campaign in 99, and he succeeded Malcolm Turnbull as the arm chair in 2000. In 2002, Greg was disendorsed by the Liberal Party as a candidate from the Tasmanian seat of Denison for his criticism of John Howard's asylum seeker policies. He was advisor to the WikiLeaks party in 2013, and he remains an advisor to the Assange legal team. And we'll start a few questions from us. So, Greg's online mics. Yeah. My first question, Greg, is a bit of a Dorothy Dixer. We've been seeing the extradition hearings, and they've been anything but transparent. So, and if Julian is extradited to the US, it'll be shrouded in even greater secrecy. So, while apologising for the Dorothy Dixon, the question is, how confident are you of the process so far? And what do we expect in the future?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Thanks for being here. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. Look, you'd have to say about the process to date that it's been less than satisfactory for Mark. I know that talking to John, who of course has been in the hearing on a daily basis, and following the hearing pretty closely, reading the transcripts. If this were anybody else, this extradition would not go ahead. There would have been a decision to it now. Is he going to get a fair trial in the United States? Not a chance. The United States has some robust courts. Courts in East Virginia are not those robust courts. What will happen is that the jury will be drawn from the family members of the security state, because that's where they will live. That's the district in which they live. And so his chances of getting a fair trial in the United States, I think, is zero.
Greg, Niels Meltzer, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, visited Julian in 2019 and said Assange displayed all the signs of a person who had been subjected to torture. He declared that the systematic misuse of legal procedures by the US, the UK and Sweden was a form of legal torture, and warned that Mr Assange's human rights would be seriously violated if he was extradited to the United States. What did the evidence from the extradition hearing tell us of the state of Julian's mental and physical health after a decade of incarceration?
Thanks, John. Look, I don't think there's any doubt that the preponderance of the evidence in the extradition hearing was that this is a man whose mental and physical health has been shattered by virtue of the fact that he's been detained for a 10-year period. His detention, of course, in the Ecuadorian embassy was worse than the detention that is meted out to maximum security prisoners. In this sense, maximum security prisoners get at least 1 hour out of cell each day, but sometimes more. They do get some form of exercise, they do get some form of mental health support, some form. He had none of those features. And so to extradite a person in those circumstances, as I say, if this were any Tom, Dick and Harry, that extradition wouldn't take place, because the mental and physical health of the person is a material factor in the extradition. And there would be great alarm expressed by a court that an extradition would take place in circumstances where that person's physical and mental health had suffered so greatly over the past 10 years through no fault of their own.
Greg, back in 2010, Julian said of the war, talking about the Afghan war diaries, that thousands of war crimes had been committed. 10 years later, we now have conclusive evidence from none other than the Inspector General of the Australian Defence Forces, Paul Brereton himself, that Australian soldiers committed war crimes in Afghanistan. Now, bearing this in mind, what kind of impact will this have on Julian's case, if any?
Well, let me just go back a step. I just find it amazing that 2 or 3 weeks ago we had the Australian media lauding itself, patting each other on the back, as they rightly should, because of the exposures of what had happened in Afghanistan. Nick McKenzie and other journalists had led the charge on this. And yet, with very few exceptions, these journalists did not stop to think for a moment that one of their own is in fact facing an effective death penalty for doing exactly what they've done. I sent Nick McKenzie a text, because I know Nick pretty well, and said, any chance of mentioning Assange in any of your media? I haven't heard back, and I think that says volumes about the response to the Australian media and the hypocrisy of the Australian media when it comes to this issue. To answer your question directly, it's difficult to say what impact that would have on a jury. For example, watching the collateral murder video. It's difficult to say, because I've already said that I don't think he'll get a fair trial. And I think that was the expert evidence that he wouldn't get a fair trial, because you're going to get members of the jury who are so tainted and so biased, walk in there with great bias. And so it's difficult to say whether or not it'll have any impact. If it was an Australian jury, for I think the collateral murder video, if it was shown to a jury, would be quite telling and quite powerful in a defendant's case, but unfortunately I don't think that's going to be the case in the United States.
Greg, many critics have described the extradition hearing as a show trial. What are your views on this? How has the hearing been handled by Judge Vanessa Vareitza?
Well, I think a more experienced judge would have handled it differently. I think there wouldn't have been the restrictions that were placed on the submissions, restrictions placed on the time that could be allocated to re-examination, for example. So I think it reflected that fact. I wouldn't call it a show trial. I think in this sense that a show trial, of course, is about to come. A show trial will be in East Virginia. These proceedings are weird proceedings. Extradition proceedings are quite political. They're administrative. But I think the real issue is that if this judge rules in favour of extradition, that is alarming, and it will be then up to the higher courts in the United Kingdom to ensure that that extradition is overturned. She ought not to extradite on the evidence. It's abundantly clear, and I've said this to many, it's abundantly clear that there's no basis for extradition. And yet you can't rule out the possibility, and in fact I think the probability that she will decide that extradition should take place. That I think reflects poorly on the English judicial system.
If the current case doesn't go Julian's way, what legal avenues are available to him in the UK before he is extradited?
Well, at the end of the day, of course, there's politics involved in this. The government has to say yes to it, but the English courts at a higher level have got some track record in pushing back against the executive on human rights. We saw the UK Supreme Court push back on Brexit last year when Boris Johnson tried to improve Parliament. We've seen they've got a pretty long tradition in the UK Supreme Court, which is like our High Court, of pushing back when the government wants to send people back to places where they're likely to be tortured. They're a much more progressive court than Australia's High Court. And so I think when it comes to the courts, and I think this is a view of my colleagues, when it comes to the courts, there may be some joy. The issue, of course, is whether the United Kingdom insists on this extradition, or whether Boris Johnson says, look, enough's enough, this has all gone too far, and loses interest in the matter and says, I'm not going to extradite. I think, and that's the political question.
Greg, Niels Melzer, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, said in an interview with the German webzine Republic about the behaviour of the Swedish police in the alleged rape case that he'd looked at the original documents. He speaks fluent Swedish, and he could hardly believe his eyes. According to a testimony of the woman in question, a rape had never taken place at all. And not only that, the woman's testimony was later changed by the Stockholm police without her involvement in order to somehow make it sound like a possible rape. This is a quote from him: I have all the documents in my possession, the emails, the texts, the messages. This seems outrageous. What can you tell us about this?
Well, John, I agree with Niels Melzer, and I certainly discussed some of those matters with Julian many years ago, and I've discussed them with others. I think the conduct of the Swedish justice system was appalling in this particular case. Firstly, the allegation that was made was not a sexual assault that is known to English or Australian or American law. It's a highly nuanced and controversial, driven by ideological issues and conflicts in Sweden, and a relation to use of condom or not, essentially, without getting into it. Secondly, though, there's no doubt that this was political, because what we had here was people who were reluctant to give evidence, reluctant to be complainants in this particular matter, being pushed by a very aggressive prosecutor running various agendas, And then, of course, you had the conduct of the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service in the UK, the famous email that Stefani and Marizzi, I think, found, which indicated that, telling the Swedes not to go weak on the matter, that this was no ordinary case. So it was a ruse and an abuse of power in order to try and get Assange to Sweden for the purposes of rendition to the United States. I don't think there's any doubt about that, and Swedish justice system, such as it is, certainly did not cover itself with glory, and I think was highly conflicted in this case from the start, and it was, frankly, as I said, an abuse of power.
All right, thank you very much for joining us, Greg.
I appreciate it, and to John and Gabriel, good luck tonight. It's, can I just say, it's also fundamentally important that people keep pushing the Australian government on this, keep going to see your local MP, harass them until, in a polite way, until they do something. Andrew Wilkie and his team of MPs are doing a great job, but there are 24 of them. We need more MPs on this issue. It is a fundamentally important issue coming into the new year, and we've just seen Kylie Moore-Gilbert come back to Australia, which shows this: when the Australian government wants to get someone back to safety, they can do it, and this, of course, is the most obvious case. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg.
Yeah, thanks, Greg.